Today, I am here with Dr. Shona Johnston, and she is a pediatrician turned coach who helps overwhelmed medical professionals find their way through difficult situations. So, Dr. Shona, thank you so much for joining us here today. I am excited to talk with you.
Thank you so much for having me today.
So, I wonder if you would start by telling us your own loss story and how it opened your eyes to coaching.
Yeah, so my little girl, Gail, very sadly was stillborn at full term in June 2016. So she would have been 7 this coming June. So quite a long time ago now, but still, look, she would have been my little girl. She still is my little girl, really. And so it it was completely unexpected for us, and I was 40 plus weeks pregnant, and then she stopped moving. So I went to the maternity assessment unit to be seen and examined. And really sadly, we were told they couldn't find her heartbeat at that point. So after after that initial news, we actually went home for a little while to go and be with our older daughter, Freya. And then I went into labor that night and went back to the hospital where she was born early the next morning. And of course, she was very still and silent. And we didn't know we were going to name her, but one of the midwives who was with us was called Gail. And so we called her Gail, and her middle name is Barbara, which is her granny's first name. Sorry.
Oh,
And
beautiful.
so we were able to spend time with her in the hospital. We were in a bereavement suite, which was really private and cut off from the rest of the hospital. So I didn't hear, for example, any other babies crying or anything like that. And we were able to keep her in a cold cot. So the nurses actually, they wrapped her up really, really beautifully in really beautiful blankets. And she just looked so beautiful and just like she was sleeping, really. And the cold cot sort of slowed her deterioration. So we were able to spend more time with her. And so we spent time reading books to her and talking to her. And I was able to give her a bath with one of my friends who was she still is a neonatal nurse. And that was really very special to me. And some of my friends were also able to come and visit us. And my parents came to meet her as well. So we had 2 really, really, really special days with her in the bereavement suite before we said goodbye. And I got sort of ready to say goodbye to her at that point, and then went home. And then we had to wait until she had postmortem. And then we actually so at that time we were living in the south of England, but we knew that we wouldn't necessarily be living there for forever. And we both have family in Orkney, which is an island in the north of Scotland. And so we actually took her back home to Orkney to be buried.
Mm.
So we had her funeral there, and she's buried in like the most beautiful place. It's so beautiful. And she's got this really stunning view over the sea. And it couldn't be more beautiful for her. Yeah, so
Wow.
that was what happened to me.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
Well, I'm so sorry for your loss, of
Thank
course,
you.
but I love the way you speak of her. You can tell it's just such a filled with so much love and so much peace for something that is really hard to make peace with.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that there's a certain amount of peace now. And over time, I've been able to tell my story a number of times. So I think that has helped with that peace. Obviously, in the beginning, it was absolutely devastating. And Yeah, and if I could go back, of course, I would change everything. And there's still a very profound grief, but I am definitely more at peace with things now.
Aw, that's beautiful. Well, the interesting thing about you is that you are a pediatrician.
Mhm.
So how how did you return to work after this experience to then go into an office where you're working with children?
Yeah, so that was really one of the hardest things I found. It was just incredibly challenging for me. And in many ways, I was actually really lucky because I was able to have mm, time off work after she died. I was entitled to have a full year's maternity leave.
Oh,
And so I took that time and was able to have that as Gail's time. And I spent my time really deeply grieving for Gail and doing sort of memory things and making scrapbooks and looking at photos and of course spending a lot of time crying and processing everything. But I knew that the biggest challenge for me was going to be going back to work as a pediatrician. And when I first when she first died, I actually said, I'm not going back. I can't ever go back.
yeah.
And I guess over time things changed and I felt that I needed to have a go and try and see what it was like. And I felt like I owed it to Gail, I guess, that she would want me to go back to work. So yeah, so going back, it was really, really challenging. And even going into the hospital the first times, or even for quite a long time, was really challenging in itself, just going in the front door because I went back to work in the same hospital where she had died. Although it was a different department, it was still very wrapped up in my story. And I would go past the coffee shop where we had been and the bereavement offices where we had gone to have to register her death. And all these things were really very triggering for me. And then of course when I went back to work, I actually went back to work in pediatric intensive care,
Mm,
mostly because I knew many of the people who worked there and I had a really amazing supervisor colleague who worked there and who was very supportive to me. But of course, I was looking after really, really sick children and babies. And so some of these were babies who, well, of course, you get really triggered by seeing babies when you've
yeah.
when you've had a baby who's died.
Yeah.
And I found myself feeling jealous of these women who had babies who were alive, even though they were really sick. So
Mm,
I mean, I think I had enough insight to see that that was my issue and not theirs.
right. Right.
But I also had times when I would come up to the notes of a baby and I found that the mum had previously had babies who died. And I didn't know that before and nobody had told me. And I found myself getting very upset at the end of a bed when I felt like I needed to be really professional with
Mhm.
actually with that
Mm,
patient and that parent. So those were things that were really, really tricky. And then
really
um,
challenging.
the kind of overall grief thing as well that I mean, my confidence was really low and I felt really exhausted when I finished a day's work. And I I actually initially found it quite difficult to have sort of normal conversations, like this sort of small talk. I found it quite hard to engage in. Um, and so that was with colleagues and with patients alike. And I always wanted to talk about more serious things or to talk with colleagues about Gail. And then I also had some like word finding difficulties. So where if I was thinking about a medical word that I would need to try and talk about, I would be searching my brain thinking, what's that word? It's in there somewhere. So those were the things I think I found most difficult.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
Oh, so yeah, I can't imagine having to go back in such a professional capacity when you are still grieving and so
Yeah.
overwhelmed. So how did that experience lead you to helping the medical professionals like you do now?
Thanks for asking that. What a lovely question. So when I was returning to work, I had coaching at that time. And what coaching did for me at that point was it gave me really, really simple goals and things that were really achievable for me at that time, and things that I could see that I was then making progress. And all of those little actions added up together to really help build up my confidence. And I saw my coach for about 6 months. And in that time, I was able to build up again the sort of practical skills that I had, and also my communication skills, and sort of building up my energy, I guess, again. And I was at a point in my career where I actually then needed to find another job. And I went then to go and work in pediatric oncology. And so my coach helped me with getting through that interview for that job. And I also did a presentation for other doctors about returning to work, which was a really major thing for me. It was the first time I'd ever spoken about Gail in front of people.
Mhm.
And it took a huge amount of courage to do that. And I really wanted to do it for Gail so that I could make a difference for other people who were returning to work, not just after baby loss, but for any reason, sort of mental health illness or more standard maternity leave, or people who were returning for other reasons. So I really wanted to make a difference to them and in Gail's name. And that was one of the other things which coaching gave me, was that it gave me that sort of purpose, and that using Gail as my motivation, if
Mhm.
that makes sense.
Mhm.
And that she then became my purpose for all the things I did going forward.
It's amazing.
Thank you. And then so I worked in pediatric hematology and oncology for a few years. In the interim, I then went on to have my rainbow baby, who's not so much a baby anymore. He's now 4.
Aw.
And then we moved abroad, just sort of toward when did we move? About August 2021. And I knew at that point that I was really interested in self-development and helping healthcare professionals. And I'd had a big interest in healthcare professional well-being, and particularly during the pandemic, I had set up a little well-being project within my department then. So I used the opportunity of us moving abroad to train as a coach so that I could try and help healthcare professionals again.
Oh my gosh. It seems like such a natural progression because I think we tend to forget that healthcare professionals are human
Yeah,
and
yeah.
they have very human lives and very human experiences, but their professionalism has them showing up in these places that are sometimes really uncomfortable and can be really, really overwhelming. So, what is the most common thing that you're finding these health professionals are getting overwhelmed about?
Well, I think that work in general, working in the UK in the NHS, is really overwhelming for most people who are working in it. And it's so busy.
Mm,
There are many, many expectations placed upon them, and the emotional toll is really huge. And of course, it's been really huge over the whole of the pandemic, where you've been in this situation where healthcare professionals are having something which is happening in their everyday lives and also affecting them at work. And that, I think, had never really happened before, where there was this big thing which was just such a massive impact on everybody. And there's not been really any kind of space to process that and to kind of recover from it. So quite a lot of the people that I speak to are things like about self-care, wanting to improve their self-care,
yeah.
talking about boundaries for themselves for their work-life balance. And then there are some people who want to leave the profession and go on and do other things. And I would support healthcare professionals, whether they wanted to stay within their profession or to leave. And I would support them with whatever best decision for them, really.
Yeah. Yeah, that's oh my gosh. It's a big, heavy topic, I'm sure, for so many. Um, so on the topic of loss particularly, do you think it's best if, like for you to go back into a job where there was children? Would it have been maybe easier if you went into a completely different field where maybe it was just, I don't know, general practitioner or some other type of specialty?
I I don't know. So I think in the UK, then general practitioners do see a lot of children as
Mhm.
well as
Yeah.
adults. So I wouldn't think that's necessarily easier. Perhaps if you were going back to adult medicine, maybe it would be less triggering.
Yeah.
Because in pediatrics, of course, you're always seeing children and babies. I didn't see so many babies in my job in oncology, but there's always the potential that you might then meet somebody with the same date of birth or the same name.
Yeah.
And I also did come across families who had also had stillbirths, and uh, I did find it quite tricky to know about how much to share, and should I share or should I not share my own experiences with those families. And some I did, and some I didn't, and it really depended on the kind of situation and the context of that particular family.
Mhm.
Um, and I think there are other areas of medicine which would be really tricky as well. So, for example, obstetrics and gynecology, I think that
Mm.
must be just
Mhm.
really, really challenging. I do have a friend who had a baby who was stillborn who now works in neonate,
Mm.
and I really take my hat off to her because
Yeah,
I think that's really amazing to be able to do that.
sure is. Yeah.
Um, yeah, and then also the sonographers who do the ultrasound scans for babies, I think that would be incredibly challenging as well. So all kinds of sort of hidden areas of the hospital as well. And ultimately, I think that going back to work was good for me, and and it did help me both with my grief and with my confidence going forward. And I'm glad that I did it.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
was hugely anxious
Yeah.
before I started, and during the initial month, probably 3 or 4 months, I was always hugely anxious walking in the door. But I did it.
Yeah. Well, and I think too, when you get into medicine because you love that feeling of being able to help someone and to
Yeah,
help others in your specialty. So, yeah, there is probably something really comforting about being able to do that again, but just somehow taking your personal feelings out of it. What is a piece of advice that you have for someone that is going through a loss that is a healthcare professional? What would be a great first step for them to do before they return to work?
so I think there's a few things. One of the biggest things which helped me was that I found a peer network of other doctors who'd had baby loss. And those were my biggest supporters of going back to work. So that was one. The second thing is finding an advocate at work. So somebody who you can speak to, who you really trust, and who you know that will have your back and will be able to advocate for you with. So, for example, I had some issues with HR, and they didn't pay me for 2 months. And so I had somebody who chased up that for me because I just didn't have the capacity to do that at the time. So having an advocate, somebody who was really there for me, that was really helpful. And then the coaching was hugely helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you said that about having an advocate because I think that's true any in any
Yeah.
job. I think it's so helpful to have someone go before you and say, "Okay, well, here's what she's willing to talk about. Here's what she's not willing to talk about. This is how it needs to be handled when she comes back." And I think just that kinda takes some of the uncomfortableness out of the whole situation if it's possible.
Yeah, absolutely agree.
Who are your Is it someone who has experienced loss, or do you just keep it specific to coaching medical professionals who've had a loss? Is it any kind of coaching that they need? What are some other areas of scope of your coaching that you do with medical
Yeah.
professionals?
So I haven't so far coached anybody who's had a significant baby loss. Not to say that I wouldn't at all.
Mhm.
Um, so most of the healthcare professionals I have coached, and these are probably the people that I like working with the most, are people who've had a really tough time for some reason or another and are overwhelmed. And they may have had some personal loss of
Mhm.
some kind or another. And and they just want to find their joy again and their
Mm.
purpose.
The demands are so huge on
Mhm.
them, isn't it? That it must be really hard to try to live their life and practice their their craft.
Yeah, and that work-life balance thing, I think it is tricky for everybody, right? And I can sometimes really difficult finding a balance for everybody. But I think when you're working so many hours a week, and i- in healthcare professionals, they would tend to give their all during their working hours, and sometimes they give their all until there's really nothing left for them to give, and the emotional toll of it can be really huge. So, I mean, if you were a midwife looking after a mum who's had a baby who's died, I mean, sure that that must be just so heartrendingly awful for the caregiver, for the midwife and the doctors looking after them, as well as for the family who are experiencing that loss. And I don't really know how much support they necessarily get in the moment. And it might be that they are able to have a chat with their own colleagues or have a cry later on in the day when they finish their shift. But there's not necessarily a kind of big support for them. I think things are changing. I think things are getting
Mm,
better from that point of view, and there is a bit more emotional support available. But it's just the kind of tide is shifting a little.
mm. As you were saying that, it made me think of my own doctor, and at the time of my loss, I remember her hugging me after she delivered the babies. She hugged me and she cried. And I think we forget because they're in the professional role and, well, they must see this, they must see this fairly often, I would guess, depending on their patient load. But we forget, I mean, they're parents too, and
Mhm.
they're taking that home with them, and it affects them too. It's a lot to carry.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. What would be a sign that someone should be reaching out and looking for some help or some sort of coaching if they're a medical professional and feeling overwhelmed?
Well, that's a good question. So I think even if they just feel like they're overwhelmed or they feel like maybe something's not right for them, maybe they're feeling a little bit lost within themselves, or they're feeling that there might be something else that's out there for them. And yeah, I really feel like so many healthcare professionals could benefit from coaching. Um,
Mhm.
really, really they could. And I think it's also important to say that for some people, if they're completely burnt out, then they probably don't need a coach to begin with. They probably just need to have time off work and to see their doctor to start with. But maybe at the time that they're thinking of going back to work, then that's the time that I think that coaching can really be helpful for them.
To prepare them to go back in
Yeah.
and feel strong and have that support.
Yeah,
Really
absolutely.
important. So you lived abroad. You said you're living in the Netherlands right
Yeah.
now. What do you see that is different with the United States healthcare system that could be improved, knowing what
Mhm.
you know about different healthcare systems?
Yeah. So I'm living in the Netherlands, but we're from the UK, and Gail was born in the UK, and that's where I worked in pediatrics. So I think that one of the biggest things is really an awareness of baby loss and
Mhm.
pregnancy loss, and an awareness really so that people can be kind and can validate that loss because it's such a major, major bereavement. And I think just for healthcare professionals in particular, so that people know that healthcare professionals are human and also experience loss, and that people and that their colleagues ultimately, it would be great if they were kind and validated their losses. And then, and along with awareness, I think acknowledgement is really important. So I, of course, had a full-term stillbirth. There are other women who have babies who are born at lower gestations. That is still a major bereavement.
Yeah.
And I think that it's really, really important to acknowledge that. And then, so my care that I got after Gail had died, in terms of the fact that we were able to spend time with her in a bereavement suite and with her in the cold cot. And I really feel that that was such a special time for us. And it really made such a positive impact on my grief then. And I think that, um, I mean, I don't know lots about care in the US, but that's something which I feel maybe is different compared to the UK. So having really good bereavement care, I think would make a big difference. I mean, certainly in the UK, it could still be improved, and there's
Mm.
a lot of variation throughout the country. And I would really love it to still be improved from what it is. But that's one thing. And then the I guess the biggest difference which I've noticed is in terms of paid time off work
Yeah.
after a loss. And so again, there's different sort of legalities in the UK. It's so that if you, in the UK, if you have a stillbirth after 24 completed weeks of pregnancy, then you're entitled to maternity leave, which in the UK is up to a full year of work. It's not all paid. Some of it is, and it will depend on the employer.
Mhm.
And before 24 weeks, then women are not entitled to maternity leave unless the baby was born alive.
Mm.
And so that is classed legally as a miscarriage for 24 weeks. And so those women, they would tend to be given sick leave. So they would still have time off work, and it would probably be paid, but it would just be a different kind of leave. And so that would be one of the biggest things which I feel could be improved in the US, because I my understanding is that you have very short maternity leave or unpaid time, and it's really quite invalidating of such a significant bereavement. And I know that the time that I had off work, I felt like I was doing the work of grieving.
Yeah.
And that was time for Gail. It was like one of my colleagues wrote in a card to say to me, "This is Gail's time." And that's how I used the time. And I mean, I would not have been able to go back to work after a few weeks. There's no way that I would have been able to. And had I been pressured into that, I just don't think I would have ever got back to work. So being able to have the time off without the pressure made some of the difference for me to be able to go back to work, if that makes sense.
It does. Yeah. And I think in your level of patient care,
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how you provide patient care when you can barely breathe
Yeah.
after
Yeah.
just, I don't know, what do they give here? Maybe 4 or 6 weeks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, those are such great points. I love the idea of a bereavement suite. That would be, and maybe they have them in larger hospitals, but I know most small hospitals do not. Mine did not. I was able to hear the babies crying down the hall, and
Oh,
that's a hard, yeah,
that's
it's
really hard. Really
really
hard.
hard, and the time that you got to spend with her, it just that was such a gift, and yeah, that is something we can all be advocating for in all of our hospitals, is to install something like that where bereaved parents are cared for and felt like they're cared for and not just, waiting to go home.
Yeah, absolutely. And um, they actually had a bed where my husband could have stayed had he wanted to. He wanted to go back and be with our older daughter. But it was just really nice knowing that he could have stayed if he'd wanted to.
Yeah.
And there was like a sofa and a TV. It was pretty basic, but it was there, and there was also an ensuite bathroom, which is not very common in maternity hospital in the
Yeah.
UK. And so that was really that that strangely made a big difference to me as well. And
Well,
just having that privacy
yeah.
really.
Yeah. At that time, it's every little detail
Yeah.
makes a
Yeah.
difference. Yeah, for sure. Well, I love the work that you're doing, and it's making such a difference, I'm sure, with the people that you work with and the medical professionals. What do you think is the biggest difference in the stress level right now since COVID? Since the
Oh gosh, yes. So I think that people were really overwhelmed and stretched even before COVID, and
Yeah.
since COVID, I think it's just been really awful
Yeah.
and really difficult. And I know that when I was working, it was very busy all the time, and it was tricky getting breaks and and things. And of course, you're doing your very best with patient care, but uh, yeah, I think that well-being for healthcare professionals has really suffered over the pandemic.
I do too. I think it is an all-time importance that they learn to take care of themselves
Mhm.
and start to, create some change, or the quality of care is just going to go down, and it's not what anyone wants. It's not what the hospital wants, or the medical professional, or the patient. So I love that you are creating that space for them to heal
No,
and
thank you.
get the help that they need. Where can people find out more about the work that you do?
So my website is www.drshonajonstoncoaching.com. Johnston's got a T in it. And so there's more information there on my website about what my services are, some of my courses and workshops that I do. And I've also got a free resource which you can download from there, which is about ways to enhance your well-being at work.
Mm, much, much needed. Thank you so much. I'll be sure to link all of that in the show notes to this
Oh, thank you.
episode. But thank you so much for coming and sharing your beautiful story of Gail, and for all the work that you're doing to help a very, very needed part of our society. So thank you,
Mhm.
Dr. Johnston.
Thank you so much for having me.